Thank you for coming, Mr. Zolyan. I'm very pleased to have you here in our studio, especially this moment, actually after years since the Velvet Revolution in Armenia. I'd rather start with the question about you personally and about the reason for your decision to become a politician, to enter politics actually, which has a history of not a year even, right?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Didi Madloba. I was a political analyst until recently, and when the revolution happened, I was covering it as a political analyst, writing articles, giving interviews, and so on. Even though I was obviously, as 95% of population in Armenia, I was rooting for the success of the revolution. But then, when the elections, it became obvious that the elections would be held in December. I was contacted by people who were putting together the list of the My Step Alliance, which is now the ruling alliance in Armenia, and they suggested me to become part of the team. And it was a difficult decision because...
How long did you think?
Well, I didn't think that long. I was actually in one of the European capitals at a seminar, and I was talking to a friend of mine from another post-Soviet country, and I was discussing with her. I said, I got this offer and I don't know should I take it or not, because life of politician is very complicated and so on. No.
Okay.
And she said, are you crazy? We cannot even dream about something like that. And I said, okay, you convinced me. I really have to take this opportunity. She was from a country where there was no revolution. So she said, you're so lucky that you have this opportunity to become somebody who has influence on decision making and to contribute to actually building a country that you always dreamed about. And for me, that was convincing. Of course, I that's what I thought anyway. But to hear that from somebody else, from a person in a different situation, that was, what I really needed to hear at the moment, because I really think that this is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. Not in terms of becoming a member of parliament, which actually pays less than I used to make before. I mean, it's not an important thing, but just so that, just that small detail. But this is actually a huge responsibility, but also a huge, it's also, a blessing in a way. You know that you are, things that you were dreaming about for years, they are happening now in your country and you are part of it. So it's a great feeling, and I'm really glad that I said yes.
Still feels great?
Well, there is a lot of stress.
Only,
obviously, there is a lot of stress. There is some disappointment. Things are much more complicated than they seem, when you're outside of the government system. And you actually realize that in a democratic country, if you are part of the government, it doesn't really mean that much. I mean, you still have to follow what the society tells you. Much more than you can, dictate your will to the society, which is how it should be. So in this sense, yes, it is probably very complicated, but it's still worth it.
Actually, after the Velvet Revolution, you were writing about the threats and risks, outside and inside threats, forecasting some processes and challenges. How did they realize? And what Armenia have been able to avoid, what kind of risks, and what kind of risks do you see ahead?
Well, usually revolutions are very, risky affairs, and in most countries, after revolutions, you've had periods of economic instability, political instability, complications with neighbors, etc. And immediately after the revolution, there were a lot of voices, some of them related to the old government, some of them independent, that were warning about the dangers and risks. And one of the things they were saying is that the economy would crumble. We still, throughout the year, we have seen some fluctuations in the economy, but in general the economy is doing well. If you look at the currency rate, for example, of the Armenian dram, the Armenian currency, it has been almost unchanged throughout the whole period, the whole year. And we have to understand that even though we say that there's been a year since the revolution, that's not entirely true, because the elections took place only in December. So before December, we had a sort of a constitutional crisis in which there was a prime minister who was the leader of the revolution, but the parliament was still dominated by the Republican Party, which was it's a recipe for disaster. But again, we were able to avoid all the dangers that are related to that. So we had a very smooth political transition. That's another risk we were able to deal with. And the third biggest risk was the international situation, more specifically the Karabakh conflict. There was a risk that the internal developments in Armenia could lead to an escalation in the Karabakh conflict, and this has been avoided too. In fact, there have been less incidents on the line of contact, as we call it, in Karabakh than before the revolution. And
what's the reason for that?
well, there are many reasons. One of them is that there is
New policy, new attitude.
Well, it's a yes and a no. So there is a new policy in the sense of, we have a government now which has complete legitimacy and trust inside the country, so it can be more assertive in its foreign policy, and it has more respect abroad. So in this sense, for all the international players, it does. The picture has changed. In the past, you had a government in Armenia which had legitimacy issues, which had a problem with its own population, which obviously made it weaker on the international stage. So in this sense, there is a new situation. At the same time, we cannot say that our priorities in foreign policy have changed, or our priorities in Nagorno-Karabakh resolution have changed, because these are dictated by our geopolitical situation. So, there's this saying that politics is the art of the possible, and whatever our values, whatever our belief when it comes to the development of the country, we still are dependent on the geopolitical realities, and we have to follow the same course which has been followed since Armenia became independent. The difference is the style of foreign policy. So if in the past, unfortunately, Armenian governments have been too dependent on foreign actors because they didn't have enough support at home, now our government is very it has, as I said, the trust of its population, and it means it can be more assertive on the international scale, the national stage.
But there are no changes in the policy in general, you mean?
Well, there are, if we go more specifically, so for example, if we go to Karabakh issue, the big format of Karabakh resolution, which is the OSCE Minsk group, it hasn't been changed because this is, it has proven that it works. It has worked in order to prevent a new escalation. But at the same time, there have been some changes. For example, we are now raising the issue of participation of Karabakh in the talks. We are saying that we cannot discuss any specific recipes of conflict resolution before we are able to take away this atmosphere of hatred, propaganda, nationalist propaganda, militarist propaganda. We are saying to our partners from Azerbaijan, let's put this all aside. Let's have a dialogue between the societies, which shouldn't be restricted only to heads of state or heads of governments. We should have a wider dialogue because we don't believe in elitist peacemaking. We don't think that the prime minister or the president, they could gather in one, in a city in Europe and talk to each other and come up with the best resolution of the conflict, and then the peoples will just accept it. We don't believe in that. We think that the societies of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Karabakh, they have to come together. They have to have a dialogue between each other, and from this dialogue, the resolution will be born. But this has to take time. So in this sense, we do have a new philosophy of approach to the conflict resolution.
Which part of the societies should be involved in the process?
Well, ideally, all society should be involved. Obviously, it's difficult to organize, but today's technology gives some opportunities for that. And we have Armenians and Azerbaijanis talking to each other on the web, on the internet. And Prime Minister Pashinyan once referred specifically to that, saying that why should we always quarrel on the internet? You know, why can't we talk about matters in a more constructive way? But obviously there has to be a dialogue on the high level, and there has to be a dialogue between civil societies, between intellectuals. And in order to organize that, first we have to do away with the militant rhetoric, because unfortunately in the past there has been a lot of I don't want to single out our Azerbaijani partners at the moment, you know, so I will say that on both sides there was a lot of militant rhetoric, calls for solving the matter through, you know, military means, and this is the first step. We have to get rid of all that, and after that we can start discussing certain models of conflict resolution, but not before we create a safe space for this discussion.
Yeah, Karabakh is a big issue, and I would continue that for longer, but
we have to talk about it for ages.
So we have to keep.
Start. Yes.
We have to go on with the interview with other issues also, which are also interesting for our audience. Corruption issue. How successful is the government in fighting corruption? And do you see that you have to compromise in this fight in some terms? Because Georgia has some kind of the same.
Well, corruption is,
history.
I would say, probably number one issue, and it was one of the main reasons why the revolution took place. And I think the new government has been quite successful in combating corruption, in a sense that there is no systemic corruption anymore in Armenia. What I mean by that is, in the past we had a pyramid in which, from the very low level, let's say some police officer who's taking a bribe, it went all the way up to the very top. And there was a hierarchy of corruption. And this is gone now. So this whole system of corruption is destroyed. There was a situation which I could describe as capture of state, in which there was some informal network which had captured the state institutions, and corruption was the main reason for its functioning. So basically the whole state system, it functioned in the interests of this corrupt group of people. So this has been removed.
Where are those people now?
Well, some of them are in jail. Some of them are being, right now as we are speaking, they are on trial. As for example, there was this so-called General Manvel, who was actually a military hero, but after the war ended he became a very corrupt person, and he had, when he was arrested, they found a whole private zoo in his mansion. It was like, from some kind of TV series. Like, we couldn't believe what we were seeing on television, that he had a whole collection of cars, including emergency car, like medical emergency car, which was donated to the army, and somehow he had appropriated it. Why, we don't know. We hopefully will know about it from the trial which is going on. Some people are not in Armenia now, so they are under investigation, but they are hiding, and some of them are asking for political asylum somewhere. As for example, a former government official who was known to be the monopolist of importing bananas. He was known as the Banana King. He's now under investigation. He's asking for political asylum. And in some cases, there have been cases where the damage which was done to the state was, it was basically the money that was due to be given to the state was returned.
I see.
Because we have to draw a line somewhere, and the line for us, the line is between the state officials and businessmen. So if you were in the past a person who was doing business, you might have been forced to pay certain bribes, so you were involved in corruption in some way. But if you have been able to, restitute the damage you've done, then, and if you are able now to play by the new rules, then it's one thing. It's another thing if you were a state official and you used your position to get rich, to draw others out of business. But in any case, the biggest principle is that we would rather let go somebody who is guilty than condemn somebody who's not guilty. So we have been very careful in order to have a legal process completely according to the law, not to let our assumptions or the common beliefs about certain people, because you know how it goes. I'm sure it was the same in Georgia, that everybody knows that this guy is
that's
corrupt.
what I wanted to.
But do we have proof that he's corrupt? Can we prove it in the court? Only in that case.
Are you careful enough?
We are trying. We are trying,
in the frame
actually
of
we are
judicial
getting.
System. When you say we and new rules, what do you mean? New rules?
By new rules, we mean that
legislation or just
basically,
rules?
if you look at what was Armenia's, how things in Armenia looked in the past, there was one situation in theory, what is written in the laws and how it's all presented to the outside world, and the de facto situation. So in theory things were good. We had a functioning market economy. We had sometimes occupied high places in doing business index, for example. In reality there was a system of monopolies. Certain people had monopolies on certain fields of economy, and there was a system of corruption. Now we are saying if you are a businessman who hasn't done any major crimes, and you are able to survive in the real free market situation without bribing anybody, without using your connections to advance your business, then you're fine. If you are trying to use the same practices that were used in the past, then
You still say we are saying. Who are you? You, the alliance, or the court? That's what I'm trying to understand and put line
I think
between.
I would say this was a consensus in Armenia after the revolution, and the votes that we got was based on this consensus that there has to be a line drawn after the old regime. But we are also, obviously, there are issues which have to be worked out by the courts, but then there are issues which cannot be worked out by the courts, but they still exist. So for that we need a system of transitional justice. And we are, now by we I mean Parliament, we are going to have a whole process. We are going to start discussing a system of transitional justice. There are different models in the world which have been applied, and we are thinking about more restitutive model of transitional justice. So it means that, rather than focusing on punishing, we will be focusing on
getting
it back, or dealing with those people who suffered because of that. People who lost their homes, people who lost their jobs, and so on. So our priority is to not to punish, but to help the people who have suffered as a result of that. But obviously, also we have to go through a process when all the crimes of the previous government and people who were close to it, they will be discussed, they will be named, there will be a legal process. In some cases, there will be probably an amnesty, because we cannot, as I said, we cannot put too much focus on punishing people. But this is a process that we have to go through as a society, as a country, as a nation.
How would you assess the quality level of independence of the court judicial system in Armenia, taking into consideration all the experience of those years of independence of the country? So 10-point scale on the 10-point scale.
I mean, it's hard to put a point to this.
Well, as you wish.
There are several aspects to this. Okay. So one is that today the executive government is not trying to somehow apply pressure on the courts. So this has been a very clear principle, and everybody, starting from Pashinyan and all the other figures in the new government, they have been saying that this is a red line for us. We are not going to be telling the judges what to do on certain cases. If
one day Pashinyan decides to just
So that's the next question. The next question is that we also need to go through judicial reform to ensure that this cannot happen in the future. I personally don't believe that Pashinyan one day will decide to do that, but maybe he does, or maybe the next prime minister who's elected in 5 years or 10 years, they will want to do that. So we do have to go through a judicial reform to ensure the independence of the courts. How exactly we do it, it's still a matter of debates, because there are basically two approaches to that. One approach is that you should take away all the corrupt judges because of the things they had done in the past, but then the problem is, who do you bring in their place?
So the system,
Another approach is that you just leave them as they are and just make sure that they are independent. Even if, some things happened in the past, now if there is no pressure on them, they will start acting as they should be, and gradually they will be replaced by new people. So these are two approaches. I think they are both a bit radical. So probably, eventually, we will, as the result of all those debates, we'll come to a decision which is somewhere in between. But this is a process which is happening, and it is also related to the transitional justice issue.
Do you suppose it's the biggest challenge for the country? I mean, internally.
Oh, there are many challenges, but it is probably one of the biggest. Yes, it is a major challenge, and how we deal with it, we have to be very careful not to, because so far we have been, we call it a velvet revolution, and sometimes people are joking that this has been too velvet, because we are getting criticized a lot for not doing enough to punish all the, former regime members and so on, and for allowing some of the politicians or political forces that existed previously to continue functioning in what we call the new Armenia. But I think this is, it's not a weakness, it's a conscious decision not to apply too much pressure, because today we have a majority of 70%.
Yeah.
My Step Alliance has majority of 70%,
yes,
and it's too easy to overstep these boundaries which separate a democratic government from a non-democratic one. So we would rather, as I said, let go somebody who's really guilty, but we don't have the proof, than, break the law, and even if we're convinced that this person is a criminal, but we will never, at least I hope we won't do that. This is our intention. We would never apply pressure on the courts to condemn this person, even if we are sure that he's guilty.
Apart from being a parliament member, you are a teacher. You are teaching students, right? Do you still keep the practice?
I'm trying to, though it's becoming very difficult, because because sometimes I have the parliament session on the same day as the class, and so I miss some classes, and then I have to do them again. And at the time of the revolution, it was very difficult because everybody was on the streets. So I was meeting them at the protests. They were saying hi, and I was saying, okay, since you're here, it's okay, you get a good grade.
It's fine, you are missing the lecture. So, what's the why I started this topic? What is your feeling, what the youth is expecting from your government?
I think there's a very healthy approach among the youth, that of course they expect a lot, but they also realize that it's not just up to the government to do everything. So the young people in Armenia today have a very healthy approach, in a sense that they understand that it's not just the government that decides things. They were the ones who were basically the vanguard of the revolution. It was young people who started the protests, and the participation of young people who made the revolution successful.
And they will become the most critical.
And they will, but they also know, okay,
have they already? Or?
Well, they are critical in many ways, but I think they are also, most of the criticism I hear from the young people, it's more constructive. So you do have two groups of people who are critical of the new government in Armenia today. So on the one hand, there are the people who were affiliated with the former government, and they are just critical of everything, and they just dismiss the new government as completely, people who just were there by accident and they were just lucky and so on. And then you have people who are mostly young people from NGOs, some analysts, some journalists who are focusing on specific issues, which are debatable issues. For example, the tax reform. Now we are going through a tax reform, and the suggestion of the new government is to have a flat tax. And so, as you can understand, it's a quite a it's a debatable issue. So we have people who are against it, and then we have people who are for it, and a lot of young people, they are against it, and they do have their arguments. And actually, I've had one of my former students, so I can say I'm proud of that. We had a hearing in the parliament about the taxation system, and he came to the parliament as a member of an NGO, and he had a speech criticizing us for this tax reform. But as his former professor, I was really proud to see him there having this speech and criticizing us for what he thought we were doing wrong.
I wish your attitude stay the same for longer. Do you have a feeling, I'm very sorry we have this time limit, but actually my next question is about time limits too. Do your alliance, My Step Alliance, you and your team members have this realistic feeling that you have a real time limit, being in power, fulfilling reforms, it never lasts long if you go right?
That's definitely a concern, and at least a lot of us realize that we have this window of opportunity where we have a very strong support, as I said, 70 to 80%, and we are not always
forever.
Going to have this support. So even though I still believe that we will win the next election, but obviously this is not going to be the same kind of majority. So obviously the window of reforms will be not closing completely, but it will be becoming more narrow. So we do have to hurry up. But on the other hand, also we have to be careful not to, because we've had this painful experience in the 90s when and a lot of people are comparing us to what happened in the 90s when these young Democrats who were fighting the Soviet system, they came to power, and they started this really radical reform program, which was quite painful. And a lot of people were, as a result, disappointed with the whole concept of democracy. This is why we had 20 years of this authoritarian regime in the first place. So we are trying to keep in touch with with the society to not to make it a one direction thing, not to say that we know what's right and this is what we're going to do, and if this is painful, then it's your problem. This is not what we want to do. We have some ideas, but we're also listening to what they are saying, and we are trying to build a consensus as much as possible.
We saw Prime Minister bicycling a couple of days ago. Why does he do that? To let people feel that he is still close to them, or?
Well, he said he had gained some weight and he needed some exercise, and I can understand him as well, because that's a problem for if you work in the government. But to be more serious, I think partly he's doing that to show that he hasn't changed. He hasn't become this kind of. It's not just the cycling. For example, his cortege, the cars that are taking him to work, they are stopping at the red lights, they're obeying the traffic rules, which is something that hasn't happened in Armenia before. Because in the past, when the president had to go to work, all the streets in this neighborhood were sealed and people would have to wait and so on. So he's showing that he hasn't changed, that's one thing. And he's also, I think he's trying to promote sort of a cultural revolution in Armenia, because I'm sure it's the same in Georgia. Most people would think of going to work by bicycle as something that a normal person would never do. It's not common to ride a bicycle to work, so I think he's also trying to use the popularity that he has to promote things that he believes are progressive, and I agree with him.
Do you see any potential of, or somebody anywhere, any group of people, or I don't know, for any basis for creation of a new opposition you were mentioning in your article?
Well, there are. First, there's the old opposition, which is, as I said, they are very unconstructive, but they are very powerful in the media, and they have this constant flow of criticism, which is usually not really based on facts, and sometimes it's just, you know, this kind of, I'm sure you had the same in Georgia, you know, destroying family values, destroying the church, corrupting
many
us
things,
with the Western.
sound
So you
familiar
have
to
this
me.
discourse,
Yeah.
which is very strong. But apart from that, you also have the civil society, which is quite supportive of the new government, but also quite critical on specific issues. And you have some new parties, which are still weak, but they are quite vocal, and they have, for example, we have a Social Democratic Party, which is quite small, but recently they have been quite vocal, and they have been able to add their voice to the agenda. So I really hope that in the future, the opposition that we will have in the future, it will be based on the same values that the revolution was about. So it won't be just the old elite, you know, disguised in the new form, trying to come back to power, but it will be people who do believe in the values of revolution. They just have a different approach to, you know, making them true.
So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.